Welcome to the Civic Garden Center. I'm Bennett Delling, I'm a horticulturist here, and we have Solomon today who will be talking about ecologically thriving gardens. He is always a really good speaker. We always get really good turnouts, and I get a little jealous when I see this. I'm like, what am I doing wrong? So thank you so much for coming. We do have, for people who are interested, we have our new spring and summer class listing that I'll have at the front desk. There are a number of really good ones coming up for tying in with having a sustainable yard. We have rain barrel classes coming up, keeping rain on your property, composting classes. We do also, Chris McCullough was reminding me, we do have that small plant sale in early May, which is our biggest fundraiser for the year. We do have a fantastic aligning with this native plants booth. We will have a monarch booth that is dealing specifically with all of the different types of asclepias that attract monarchs. And we will have a booth catered to different, we're calling it flying friends, which will be all different pollinators, birds, and things along those lines. So I do recommend that you grab a class listing on your way out or check our website and enjoy the class. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Solomon Gamboa. I run a business called Pioneer Landscapes. It's focused on all kinds of ecologically minded land management, from reforestation to planting food forests and native plant gardens, all that kind of sorts of non-traditional stuff, and amongst some other things. What I want to talk to you guys about today is the role that these metropolitan gardens can play, because so many people are concentrated in metropolitan. So we just have a huge opportunity. And so basically how this is going to work is the first 10 slides are going to be a little heavy. And then we'll start to get into talking about prairies. And then we'll start talking about food forests and how they mix together and why we would be planting that in our yards. And then the last session is probably more of exactly what you expected, with specific instructions on how to maximize ecology thriving in your landscape. So we'll try to stay on schedule. So if I start ranting, just let me know. And here we go. So when we talk about ecology, first, if we're talking about, if our desire is for ecology to thrive, we have to talk about the reason why it's not thriving. So right now, about a little bit over 40% of the lower 48 states is devoted to livestock. So that means grazing, ranching, plus growing soybeans and corn and alfalfa and other forms of feed for the raising of animal farming. So we've already taken 4/10 of our country, a little bit over 4/10 of our land surface, just for livestock farming. So what that means in the landscape, we're going to surf the internet really quick. So what that means in the landscape, which is really important, this was our original biomes map. Let me see if I can get that any bigger. Not really. So this is our original biomes map. This whole area throughout here, and this is very generalized. In actuality, all these biomes are a little mixed together. These are just the general outlines. So the Great Plains grasslands, there's even patches of that in Ohio and New York. But overall, Ohio was dominated by eastern deciduous forest, and that far northeast, it was mixed with evergreen and deciduous forest. Then there was different kinds of forest types in the south, different kinds of tropical forests, very far south, big Great Plains swath, then desert ecosystems, and some interesting ecosystems in the northwest, and boreal forest up in Canada. So this was the format that ecology most thrived in before settlement. So when we're talking about making ecology thrive, we really have to remember what it was before it needed help. This is the landscape that monarchs had no problems with, or any other endangered species had no issues with. So today, the way we manage the land, this is a land use map. If you notice this big pink and light brown swath that goes from southern Texas all the way through northern Canada, it kind of mirrors the big swath of the original grasslands in that form. That is now the pinkish tones are high density livestock and high density crop. The corn belt is what we call it. It used to be the Great Plains. The light brown swath is mostly just livestock. So that's grasslands, high livestock density is the lightest brown. Grasslands, moderate livestock density is the different other shades of brown. So that kind of shows you how we've used a large portion of the land for animal farming. Then the light green is some type of forestry management, but it's also, so the lightest green is forestry, which is okay if done sustainably, but it has livestock grazing on much of it, not all of it. So that's another form of a damaged ecosystem due to our demand for so much meat. So that represents all this light green, the lightest bluish green in the east. And then the darker green is what they call forestry protected, which just means it's going to be logged, which is essential to our society, but it's protected partially from grazing. So it's not the most damaged form of forest we have. So this is just a good overall look to see, like, this is really why ecology is not thriving, and we have to understand that the people within metropolitans, which represent 4 out of 5 people, you see these little black spots on the map, here, and here, and here, and here. That's where people live. That's urban areas. So we only live on 3% of the land. And when you add in the other 1 out of 5 people, which they call rural residential, they live on another 3%. So all in all, the American population lives on 6% of the land. That's the actual maximum footprint that we can affect ecology on. So when we're planting these gardens, we have to look in that perspective of exactly what amount of land we're affecting, but we can do it in a way that affects the whole country. So we'll be talking a little bit about that later in the presentation. So I told you the first 10 slides are heavy, sorry. So this just gives a pie chart to show you about 80% of the population lives on 3% of the land, and then another 3% or another 20% of the population lives on another 3% of the land. This pie chart doesn't quite show that, but most of the land in this country is what they call rural. And that's where ecology cannot thrive due to the current formats of our agricultural system. This is just a quick pie chart. It's a decent representation. It was made in 2000, so it's a little bit inaccurate by now. But rangeland and pasture land, that's all pretty much you can call very degraded ecosystem habitat. that is now being grazed by livestock. And these numbers are in the millions. So 406 means 406 million acres of rangeland. This country is only a little bit under 2 billion acres. So 406 is basically what this pie chart shows. It's almost a fourth of the land is grazed in that format. And then more intensive form of grazing, pasture land, 120 million acres. Where we live is in this 98 million acre sliver, and that's where you get the numbers of we have 40 million acres of lawn. That 40 million acres is within that 98 million acres of development right there. So that's where we live, but our food choices affect all of this. And federal just means, that's a mix of national parks and federally owned areas that can be logged, nature preserves that are federally owned, and the Bureau of Land Management, which owns a lot of land in the West that they allow to be grazed too. And then this is the sliver of cropland, which is completely sterile, most of it, in the format that we manage it. So you can see we basically sterilized a lot of our country. So here's our metropolitan, and this is just to add perspective. You know, this is, or not everyone's metropolitan, but most people in here, this is your metropolitan, where, and it doesn't show the whole thing, but the dark green is basically county parks. The gray is basically the reflection of buildings and pavement, and the dark green veins are state parks and county parks and local parks that have tree cover. Some of the neighborhoods are pretty well forested, but not enough to actually show up green on the map. And then this is the our choices affect on that small piece of land that we live in. Our choices affect the rest of the land around us. So this is Dayton, Springfield, Columbus, Indiana's way over here, Indianapolis. All of this light green is agriculture, and it's in a very sterile format where ecology cannot start to thrive. The dark green veins are typically very steep ravines carved out by rivers and creeks that weren't flat enough to really farm. So they were allowed to just be logged and regrown. And that's what you get the dark green veins of trees from, typically growing in kind of river valleys. And this is just a zoom in to see closer of the light green. There's patches of woodlots managed for timber, and then patches of wheat, patches of pasture, corn, soybean. This is a landscape where ecology cannot thrive, but this also represents the majority of the landscape, not cropland alone, but between pasture and rangeland and cropland, that represents around a little bit under 3/4 of the country's landscape. So this is why we have this workshop today. This is why ecology is not thriving. So high impact actions in this 6%, this includes rural, residential, and metropolitan land. Creating a landscape or a garden that begins a conversation and arouses interest in your community, that is a highly impactful action. Because people are so concentrated just on 3% of the land, or the whole population just on 6% of the land, your garden is a huge opportunity to raise awareness. There's a saying, awareness precedes sustained change. If we want to change the fate for the better of the monarch or honeybees or whatever we're most interested in, pollinators or endangered species, we have to change our culture, because our culture creates the rest of the landscape. That's kind of why they call it ag, not why, but there's a reason why the word culture is in agriculture. It's the way we do things, and we can change that. Taking a stand against the use of invasive plants, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. So invasive plants, over 80% of the woody invasive plants have started in horticulture, landscaping, and spread out into the other, 97% of the land. And that's something that the horticultural industry and the nursery industry really has to start taking responsibility for, because even though it seems like we see the pears blooming on the side of the highway, and we see the metropolitans covered in honeysuckle, and now when you clear honeysuckle, it's being replaced by burning bush and barberry and privet. That is a microcosm of what is going to happen throughout the whole landscape. And our metropolitans are basically breeding zones for invasives. But we have the opportunity to stop it here, because it doesn't start out there, it starts here. Volunteering and supporting organizations that help build connection with the public and nature through actual experiences. What we're missing in our culture is the reason why I couldn't rent a venue and have 500 people show up locally to an event like this is because the people in this room represent a way of thinking or a culture that is a minority. And when you have organizations like Cincinnati Nature Center, or organizations that have naturalists that provide, or the Get Outdoor part of Green Umbrella, that provide actual nature experiences to the youth and people, that creates more people who think more eco-minded. And that is what we need in our culture to balance out the sterilization of our country through the agriculture and the demand for so much meat. Those organizations, without that, or without us having our children in nature, this movement and ecology can't go too much further than our lifespans. Put it that way. Divesting from the plus 40% of our land surface being devoted to livestock production. So the average American eats about 200 pounds of meat. I was vegetarian and vegan for a while. I'm probably eating about maybe 10 pounds a year. I rarely eat it now. But the point is, we eat the most meat out of any country, even compared with other industrialized developed countries. We don't need 200 pounds of meat per person. And the cost of that is huge on ecology and the landscape. And with our population projected to grow from 30 million upwards to 50 million, either by 2050 or 2100, or I forget. But with our population going to increase by about 40%, even if we all eat just a little less, if our population grows by 40%, we'll still be eating more. So if we can minimize that, that is a high impact action that we can take for ecology in this small piece of land. Okay, so first 10 slides are over. That's the heavy stuff. Now we get a little bit more light and fun. So that pie chart that showed urbanized areas represent about 98 million acres. Between 40 and 45 million of those acres are in lawn, which is over 20 Yellowstone National Parks. Yellowstone National Park is about 2.2 million acres. So we have this beautiful canvas to express potentially the future of our rural landscape in the urban areas. The urban areas really decide the rural landscape through our food choices and through how much wood we use, which we'll talk about. So your garden, your front yard, the maximum impact isn't necessarily the amount of pollinators it attracts. It's more so the amount of people it attracts, because people are going to affect that other 97% of the land more than we can save ecology on 3% of the land just by focusing on maximizing pollinator benefits or something like that. We have to start to think a little bit bigger about these gardens being communication devices for change, real change that affects the whole country. And that's the way we get ecology to begin to thrive again. So the 3 ways that I think, please add more in the question session, that your garden can be that communication device are everyone likes food. And there's a lot of natives and a lot of native hybrid cultivars that produce foods. That's what we're going to talk about in the food forest. There was a day, me and one of my colleagues, when I was a student at Cincinnati State, we were at the zoo, and they had this beautiful patch of forsythia, and no one was looking at it, but it was just beautiful and gold and very obnoxious in that way. And then there was this like subtle pink flowering cherry tree, and cherry trees, because they because Prunus, that genus, has a long history of a lot of cousins in this country, native cousins. When you plant a hybridized cherry tree, they still attract a lot of pollinators. So there were 3 people all crowded around this cherry tree, which definitely was not nearly as breathtaking, purely aesthetically, as this forsythia patch. But they were crowded around it because it was just covered and buzzing with bees. When you bring that kind of life to your yard and your plants are just covered in life, that attracts people on some kind of deeper psychological level, or it scares them, one or the other. But having that, I include that part as beauty. So even if a plant doesn't have a big obnoxious flower, if it attracts hummingbirds and attracts a lot of pollinators or caterpillars and that kind of thing, that's a form of beauty. Food, once again, everyone can relate with that. Even if you have absolutely no connection with nature, harvesting persimmons, harvesting fruit, once again, that's just something that can tap into something deep in our psychology, that you don't really need a connection with nature to enjoy that. You just enjoy the taste and you enjoy the action. But it helps build connection with nature and helps change culture and helps change people. And eco-function, so that's what I described with the pollination activity. That's kind of included in beauty. If it's very functional ecologically, it has a different kind of beauty element to it in the life that it attracts. So one question just to ask ourselves, if our culture, which I kind of just call belief systems, creates the landscapes from the cities to the farmlands and preserves, what can I do to foster a culture that strongly supports an eco-balanced agricultural system, more sustainable animal farming, or nationwide landscapes that allows nature to exist? So we're about done with this topic, but a few more points that I want to relay to you quickly. And I'm going to have session notes emailed, so don't worry about writing much of this stuff down. The important stuff, you'll receive that through email. But with logging, about 53% of our timber is used to build houses. And houses are getting bigger and bigger. Yes, they're getting more and more efficient. So they're still using about the same energy as the smaller houses of yesterday, even though they're bigger. But with 53% going to building houses and other buildings and furniture, which actually is a large percentage of the two, can we design smaller buildings? Can we design houses that require less wood for new developments? Can we support more renewable alternatives to wood furniture, like furniture made out of bamboo, a more renewable resource than logging wood, or cellulose from grasses? Those kinds of furniture are being produced. Another 32% of the timber we use in this country is just for paper, full third of it. So in this digital age, you would think paper demands would decrease, but with such high population growth, as that continues, we still continue to add on an additional 4% of demand for paper, the U.S., per year. So with an additional 4% demand each year, that's kind of the fate of our forest, which is the fate of ecology. So those are just the last few points before we really lighten up. So I want to show you a quick video.